Hello there. Welcome to the Maker Manager Money podcast, a podcast about entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, founders, business owners, and business partnerships. From startups to stay-ups, to inspire entrepreneurs to keep going and future entrepreneurs to just start. My name is Kyle Knowles, and it's a Friday in Carlsbad, California. We're actually in the Carlsbad room at Kiln Carlsbad. Kiln is completely killing it in the co-working space industry, and I believe that they are the GOAT. They are the LeBron James, or if you're old school, the Michael Jordan of co-working spaces. Today's guest is Brian T. Franco, founder and managing partner of Meritage Partners, a leading M&A advisory firm based in Newport Beach, California. With nearly 2 decades of experience, Brian is an expert in guiding companies towards successful exits, having deployed over $2 billion in capital across diverse industries such as architecture, engineering, and construction, or AEC for short, healthcare, tech, B2B, business to business, and B2C, business to consumer services. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Thank you for having me, and it's fun to be here. And it's interesting to hear that intro because it brings me back to kind of my journey, right, as a human, as an entrepreneur, and looking forward to unpacking that and just sharing more with you guys. So thank you for having me on the show, though.
Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for making the effort to get down here. Yeah. There's so much more to this. I mean, I've had a couple of introductory calls with you. We've talked offline. So let's get into, I guess, tell me about your childhood. Let's start there, and how you developed into an entrepreneur. Let's just start from the beginning. Did you have parents, family members that were entrepreneurs, and how did you start getting into it? Did you have a lemonade stand? Those kinds of things.
I did have a lemonade stand, and we did actually a neighborhood car wash. My brother and I, and that was fun. Those were. Gosh, I haven't thought about that for a long time. But yeah, my father was an entrepreneur. He owned several businesses, primarily service businesses, and with that wealth and with that income, he diverted that into real estate holdings, and so I saw that at a young age. I remember, my father sharing and likely bragging right about his son Brian, how I can articulate the process of a real estate transaction at 10 years old. And I knew what escrow was. I knew what purpose of deposit was. And he just loved that I knew that. But I just learned by way of osmosis, just hanging out with Dad, going to meetings with Dad. And they were boring at times, right? But you would still absorb the information. You would still hear the words being spoken. And they didn't have as much substance as they do today, but I was still absorbing it, right? And kids, I have 4, and they don't miss anything. They hear
pick it up,
everything. So my parents are today still married, and my father since retired. But in my journey, in my life, I grew up as a middle child. I had an older sister and a younger brother. Although I do call my older sister Christy, I call her my little sister. But as a middle child, I like to imagine how I come into the work that I am in today, because I was always the peacekeeper of the family. I was always the intermediary, right? Working and sorting through, I don't want to say problems, but challenges in the household dynamic. And it was always important to me that, I spent time, with everyone in the family. And, but as a middle child, you have to work harder because you're sometimes left out of the game, or sometimes you're left out of the conversation, right? Because, the baby is the baby, always will be the baby in the family, right? So they'll always get that love and attention, just like my daughter. And then the oldest will always be that guinea pig of the family, right? So,
right.
Typically the oldest child in a family is, the parents are the most strict.
Right.
And typically they're the most rebellious. And so you see that dynamic play out. And I did as a child, right? But growing up, I mean, from having lemonade stands to we would go around washing cars. And I remember one summer, the other kids were like inspired by it. They're like, well, you're making money doing this? I'm like, yeah. And you're having fun? Yeah. Can we do it? We're like, sure. And so we actually had a choice of who would help us. And so my brother and I would figure out who was like the most efficient, and we would, those that were efficient, we'd bring them back for the next job or jobs. And everyone was always so like willing to have you wash their car, right? And so that made it easy for us to step into that. But in that, we had a budget, right? We knew what our soap costs were. We knew what our time was worth. We knew, to go out there and establish the relationship with the customer to wash their car was. So we ended up, we would write this out even on pencil, like number 2 pencil and paper, and we would divvy up the payments at the end, and we do it over and over and again. And what was cool about that is years later with my son Braden, who's now 13, I went through that same exercise with him because he didn't do a lemonade stand. His niche was lemonade delivered. And so he would make the lemonade at home. They would put it in a wagon, and then they would go around the neighborhood and they would sell it. And he did great. So we estimated like, okay, 1 pound bag of sugar is, I don't remember the cost. Let's say it was $5. And then we would determine how much sugar he would use per batch and how much lemons. And sometimes he would have to buy the lemons, but sometimes the neighbor would give him free lemons, right? So it's like his cost of goods sold would change from batch to batch.
Right.
But then they would determine, okay, this is what we have to sell it for. And it was good for him. And so I believe that, that was an experience that will stay with him. And hopefully it'll stay with him in a good way, because it showed him how to be a good steward of that money that he was earning while covering his cogs and his labor, because his labor was his younger brother and one of the neighborhood kids, actually. So it was cool. But, growing up, what's unique about my story, and you mentioned that I was on the board of a women's care center. A women's care center is a leading inner city center designed to really reach out to crisis pregnancy scenarios and situations. And so as a teenage father, which I was, my oldest Jacob will be 28 in 2 weeks. And he was born in 2000. I'm so sorry. Late 1900s, 1995, he was born. I was a sophomore, second half of my sophomore year in high school. I was 16 years old, a month shy of 17. I turned 17 on January 22nd. And this whole experience slingshotted me into manhood. I knew that I was too young to be married. I knew that Jacob's mother was not my destined wife, but I knew that, look, the natural consequence of being a promiscuous child is a child is a baby, right? So, but Jacob was born, and I graduated high school at 17 and a half. I went to summer school every year. So I got those extra credits. And so it allowed me but my senior year, my second half of my senior year, I had 2 electives. One of them was work experience. So I worked. And the other one was an art class. So I literally finished high school halfway through my senior year, but the last half was me just filling out a coloring book, because it was an art class. It was more than a coloring book, right? And then I was working, and I worked at at that time I worked at a movie prop house. We had nothing but medical movie props on the sets. We had permanent sets on Chicago Hope and ER, if you remember those shows.
Yeah.
And we did, fun sets, like we had a set on, what was the movie where Arnold Schwarzenegger gave birth? Is that like, not Kindergarten Cop, but one of those?
It's not Twins.
No, not Twins. I always forget the name of that movie, but we did that whole scene where Arnold Schwarzenegger gave birth to a child. I have to remember the name of that movie if I'm going to say this story. And then there was a funny movie. Well, not funny, but it was a terrible movie, which made it funny. Volcano. And Volcano was a movie about how the La Brea tar pits in LA erupted into a volcano. And so it was just mass hysteria. And it was a fun experience, but we managed that whole set. We had gurneys, and it was a cool experience. So I did that while I was in college. And in college, I did this a la carte education where I was studying accounting. My desire was to be a CPA, and I also enjoyed law. So I specifically studied real estate law and ended up earning my real estate broker's license at I was 20 or 21 years old. So I've always had it, and it was fun to me. So right out of college, I ended up working. One important thing, I also went to school for computer science, specifically with an emphasis in networking, computer networking. And so we learned a lot about the Novell networks at that time, right? Which was the origin of, if you used Google Drive, you can figure out Novell, right? Right. It's just permissioning and access rights, right? Yeah. And so with my accounting background and with the computer networking emphasis, I worked with a mortgage company that I looked on the other side of the table and just saw the movement and the puzzle pieces being solved on the daily basis. So I applied my accounting background to that, and I immediately got into mortgages, not within a year, right? And which then led to, which was more residential focus, that evolved into commercial and industrial, which evolved into business lending, SBA products like 504 products and 7A products. And through that and in that, experience, and I was still in my early 20s here. I was, 22 years old, going through all of this and experiencing all of this. And what we did was, my business clients were very happy with the performance and the work and my ability to access the capital that they needed. Granted, I mean, these were small transactions at that time. I mean, $1 million deal for me at that time was like, I felt like I was on top of the world, right? I mean, where today is like, typically we like our clients to be profiting $2 million or more a year, right? Right. So you see the evolution, but at that time, I was able to cut my teeth and, learn about modeling and about debt service and about, how a balance sheet impacts underwriting, and ultimately, allowing for an approval or not, right? Right. And so what I found is that our clients were asking us, because a lot of these, not a lot, but some of these financing requests were for business acquisitions. These business acquisition loans were unique because not a lot of folks were servicing this type of clientele. And I just knew it very well. And that led to clients saying, well, look, I want to acquire this company and I want to acquire that company and I want to scale my company. So that led to me targeting opportunities for them. So I was at that time my name was very well known in the auto towing industry. And
why?
Not a very, the glamour was in the green, but why is because I had a couple clients in that space. And auto towing is one of those industries where you just kind of imagine like a dirty, grimy, greasy guy just coming out and servicing a car, but it was much more than that. And these clients, they had contracts with AAA, to do lockout assist, battery jumps. So they did do that service aspect, all right? But there was also contracts with California Highway Patrol, the CHP, with the police departments, with the sheriff departments. And these contracts were well sought out. So think of, waste management. Waste management is the nation's largest rubbish collector, trash collector, right? And so waste management has municipal contracts to collect that trash, which is ultimately paid through the cities typically, right? And so the towing operations were no different. So they had these contracts with municipalities. So let's say you were unfortunately in a car accident, right? So if you're on the highway, AAA cannot come to tow you. The contract was with an approved highway patrol tower. So they would come, they'd move you off the freeway, and then if you had a third-party service to come get you, great. They would figure that out. But these contracts were very valuable, and so what made them valuable was the amount of cash flow they would generate, and there was the money that was being made was not just on towing the vehicle, but also the aftermath of an accident, or the aftermath of, let's say, if someone was irresponsible and had a DUI. So when you have a DUI, the driver goes to jail, but guess what? So does that vehicle. So that vehicle goes to jail for 90 days. It ranges, but 30 to 90 days. And so they tow your car, they lock it up, just like the human being gets locked up, and they have to pay a daily rate for that vehicle. So 90 days later, right, and if the daily charges were $100, right, they're coming in out of pocket and spending the money to get their car out of car jail, basically. And then there was towing fees, release fees, so on and so forth. So I did, before I was 23, probably before I was 23 years of age, I probably did over 24 towing M&A transactions. And I just, there was a lot to navigate through, from not just the financing aspect, right, which was complex in itself, but how do you get these contracts they didn't have, there was no provisions in those contracts that allowed an owner to transfer the contract to another owner. You had to go through a certain process because these were municipalities, but I figured that out. I figured out how to do it, right? And we did it. We did it rinse and repeat, over and over and over and over again. And so that led to me working with a smaller boutique group, and I was there until from about 2003 to 2005. I remember in January of 2005, we were doing a year in review of 2004. And in 2004, I was 72% of the company's revenues at that time. I was 25 years old. So in May 5th of 2005, after having this vision of building my own firm, I did it. And I filed for the corporation. And this was, keep in mind, Kyle, this was 3 months before my wife, Melody, and I were married. We were married in August 13th of 2005. And so it was scary. My son Jacob was, I think, 6-7 years old at that time. I had my first house. I was engaged. So everything just moving, right? And this year, here we sit where we sit, right at the end of 2023. This year we celebrated 18 years of the firm and 18 years of marriage, and it's been a crazy run. It's been a fun run, but so that's my journey. That's where I started, and so you think about what were the motivating drivers for me. Early on, it was my son Jacob, right? I knew I needed to be a role model for him. I knew I needed to provide for him, and so to where I sit today, I'm 44 years old. I'll be 45 next month. I've been a father and a provider longer than I haven't at this time in my life. And so Jacob's birthday is coming up on the 29th. He'll be 28. And then I have my wife, Melody, and we have Braden, who's 13, Nolan, who's 10, and Layla, who just turned 8 years old yesterday. And so we spent the evening at Knott's Berry Farm.
Happy birthday, Layla.
Yeah. We all woke up with we call it a amusement park hangover, right? We're just exhausted from
spinning around,
doing all the rides and
stuff.
walking around and just ingesting all that sugar. But it was a good time. So, but yeah, that's the story. But Meritage Partners today, we as you described, we've deployed over $2 billion in capital, and as an investment banking firm, what we do is we advise our entrepreneur clients on strategies to grow, scale, and exit their companies. what makes us unique is that we design and build a strategy for the entrepreneur that ultimately collapses time for them. The strategy is not just your typical, generate more revenue, generate more profit, right? It's more than that, because we're really reverse engineering the ultimate plan is reverse engineered, I should say, so that we can enable them to collapse time to, yes, grow and enhance their income, but to generate a massive outcome through exit strategies. And those exit strategies typically come through some sort of M&A transaction and process, creating a liquidity event, thus creating generational wealth for our clients, which, it's interesting. We're in one of those industries where the quicker we lose a client, the better, because that means
success.
That means success, right? Yeah. But I don't want to say we lose the client, because there's a fine line there where you develop lifelong relationships. And how many times, if I could count, that I've been invited to go fly fishing in Montana, with a business owner or stakeholders of a company we just sold. I mean, it's countless, right? And, but I always remind them, hey, I'm still working. That sounds great. Yeah. Every now and then I'll join, some of these adventures, and they are fun. They are. And it's very rewarding, both from, yes, the monetary reward is there.
But you're still working.
Yeah. So I'm still working, right? I
didn't sell my company. I'm not retired. Okay,
yes, exactly. I mean, certainly in the plan, right? But no, we didn't sell our company, but we do develop these lifelong relationships, and a lot of times, we maintain those relationships. We stay in touch, and of course, early on in the firm, we did zero marketing. Our marketing was by way of word of mouth and referral, and I was describing to you that, the reward is twofold for us. There's monetary value, yes. But a big piece of the reward for me as an individual is being able to solve that puzzle piece. I have, at different levels, always had the ability to look at a situation almost in 3-dimension, eyes open or eyes closed. And I can take that 3-dimensional design, whatever it may be, in the work that we do, it's really structure, right? I could pull it apart, I could twist it around, I could put it back together, I could see it inside and out. And that natural born talent has enabled me to provide the guidance that we do to entrepreneurs, because every deal, the process is the same, but every deal is different, because expectations are different. And entrepreneurs are artists, really, when you think about it. They have an artistic ability of developing a business. And no one, I would argue that, no one, you and I could be in the same industry, but we would build different companies, because we would build different cultures. And cultures is the human element of what we're building, right? And so from that standpoint, it is an art. There is science to it, yes, but there is an art to it.
So I guess what I would ask you, Brian, is pretend I'm an entrepreneur. I've grown this business for 20 years. I'm kind of ready to exit. Like, at what stage does an entrepreneur reach out to a company like yours and say, help me to get a little more hands off and get the company ready to exit? I'm ready to do this. And then typically, how long is the process of you working with a company?
So when a client is introduced, or potential clients introduced to us, and they say to me, Brian, I want to exit in 5 years. So I'll give you a call in 5 years. And my response typically is, you should probably call me in 6 to 12 months, right? And arguably we should start now. And here's why. If you want to be exited, or if you want to exit your business in 5 years, right? And depending on what you're doing, you could provide a product, you provide a service, it could be a combination thereof. But we are experts at maximizing enterprise value. And we do that by way of almost a SWOT analysis initially that helps us understand the transferability of the company. And typically entrepreneurs of businesses that are generating profit from, let's say, $1 million to $15 million a year. And this is profit, not revenue. They are a very big part of the day-to-day operation, right? And you can't surgically just remove that individual from the organization because the organization is organic at some capacity, right? So in this initial analysis, we determine, what is that? How do they score from a transferability standpoint, right? And it's a scale from 0 to 100. We want the client to score an 80 or greater, and that scoring mechanism shows us where they typically land on the valuation spectrum, right? So let's say you're in an industry that is trading at 4 to 6 times EBITDA, right? Well, which is it? Is it 4? Is it 4.5? Is it 5, 5.5? Is it 6? What is it, right? So the initial assessment that we do allows us to pinpoint on that spectrum of where you would fall, right? Are you best in class or are you struggling to get through the day-to-day, right? And if you're struggling, I mean, even if the spectrum of valuation range is 4 to 6, you might be a 2. You might be a 2.5, right? Because when you compare this to, let's say, a real estate transaction, a building, that building has a specific purpose. And sometimes it can have multiple purposes if it's going to be redeveloped. But even in that situation, it has a special purpose. And based on that purpose, it's going to derive a valuation, right? A business is not too different, right? It's designed to provide a product, a service, or a combination thereof. And if that entrepreneur is working in that business and wearing several hats, which typically they are, and that's okay, that business is going to be impacted if they were to exit. And sometimes those exits are planned when you reach out to our firm. And we've had situations where we're working with what we're dealt with. In one situation, we had a client that was in his early 40s. He was in the oil business, lubricants, commercial lubricants. And he left the office on a Friday. He was a motorcycle rider, rode over the weekend, and he never showed up to work again. He was in an accident and ended up being quadriplegic. And essentially, as time went on, he was a human vegetable. Could not run the business, was, for all we know, he was unaware of what had happened, right? So we ended up coming in, putting a strategy together. And that strategy was designed and worked on with his grandmother, right? Because his mother was not of mental capacity to kind of go through this process. And fortunately, we did get the transaction done. We sold it to a strategic acquirer because that's what's also unique about us is we're looking for that 1 + 1 = 3 or greater equation. 1 + 1, if it equals 2, that's, anyone could do that in my mind, right? But what makes us unique is finding that extra value. And that's typically through strategic acquirers or investors in the marketplace. And that's exactly what we did for this gentleman. I should say for this family. And, you feel accomplished, yes, when you consummate that transaction, but your heart also breaks, right? Because you see so many willing and able and capable entrepreneurs that go about their daily lives thinking there's no end in sight. This is not going to stop, right? I could always do this, and I could always do it at the levels that I'm showing up with at, today even. And so this is why this assessment's crucial, because it helps illustrate to an entrepreneur or the stakeholders of a company, if there's a partnership, what is the transferability of your company, and what's the viability of your business to an investor, right? Now, it's not the end of the world if you're scoring a 70, if you can't score an 80 because you are just so involved in the business. Because it just tells us, what strategy to employ, right, and to execute on. But that planning takes at least a year to, one, assess up front. There are tweaks that could be made in 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. But then there are also some transitions that will occur, over a year period. And when you take an inventory of of that analysis, there are always some items, let's say, that cannot be cured from a transferability standpoint until the deal is done. And so as long as we know that, we can plan for that, we don't come to market by way of looking, desperate or unprepared, or even in a situation where we lose leverage, right? We never go to market with that mindset, right? And with that type of plan. If those items of lack of transferability are inventoried and presented as in terms of the rationale for the transaction or the sale or merger, then that becomes the appetizing piece of this to investors and buyers, because they too are looking for that 1 + 1 = greater than 3 equation, right? If there's synergies, if there's cross-pollination, if there's some way and somehow to access critical mass, whether that's geographic reach, discipline, or even product reach. And it's the better together model, right? And so some of those items will be cured. Again, I'm repeating myself, but they'll be cured by the transaction itself. And that transaction can occur where we call it the, rip off the rearview mirror approach, where you're in the car, you rip off the rearview mirror and you never look back. And that for some entrepreneurs, that is the expectation. And we could achieve that. We could reach that with the proper planning. And with some clients, I'll give you a case study we're working on right now. It's an infrastructure company focused on dry utilities. So think of power transmission and telecom. He's 50 years old, relatively young. He's nowhere near retirement in my mind. He's got a ton of energy. I mean, more energy than you see in a typical 50-year-old. And what's unique about him is that he sits in an industry where his peer group are late in their 60s, 70, and they're looking for an exit strategy, right? But he has what we call as a platform, and that platform can grow by way of organic growth, yes, right? And that's just, hiring the right people, bringing on new clients and customers, and executing on that. But then there's growth through acquisition, where his peer group that's in their 60s, late 60s and 70s, they're looking for a way out. And he's perfectly positioned to acquire those companies, roll them up under his platform at 50. And we have a plan with him, it's just 2 years, right? A 2-year plan to do this, to approach this roll-up strategy, double the size of his company. We think we could do it in 18 months, but we're going to have to leverage the capital markets, which we're experts at. We understand based on the situation, where to access that capital. Capital typically comes in 2 forms. It's either debt or equity or a combination thereof. And figuring out that puzzle that we're discussing earlier allows them and enables them to execute on those strategies, whether it's organic growth or growth through acquisition. And at 50 years old, even if he decided to retire in 2 years, which he could, in that planning, as we develop the business, we're going to bring on his wife. I didn't mention this, I should, but his wife's the controller today. So she's the first one to exit. We're going to bring on a professional CFO. We're going to set this platform up for this growth that I'm describing. And then we've already identified his replacement, or a CEO that would replace him. And that CEO would be positioned to run a company that's twice the size that it is today. Today, they're about $20 million point of reference. Last year they were 20 million. This year they'll generate 24 of revenue. So they have substantial growth. So at the end of this strategy, he has options. He could either sell the company that we just grew, ideally doubled, or he could exit the business. He could exit the business, or he can keep the CEO that we're putting in place and just sit on the board. He has options, and that's what you always want as an entrepreneur, is options. Because if you're ever backed in a corner and you're making decisions under duress, I don't know about you, but the decisions that I've had to make under duress, when I look back, I'm not happy with those decisions, because usually I did not achieve what I had intended. I mean, granted, I learned something along the way, right? But I did not achieve or reach my intended goal or target. And that's what I love about options. And even when we negotiate, this is something that we employ in our tactics is, if an investor is giving us an offer for a client, I always encourage that investor to give us two options, right? You don't need to hit the bullseye of the target the first time. Give us two options, compare and contrast, right? Let's test what you're offering, what you're able to offer with our client. And let's see if there's a pathway forward. Now, our fiduciary responsibility is with typically the seller client, and we'll show them, by way of comparison, what is more aligned with their expectations, what maximizes enterprise value while minimizing risks and providing some level of liquidity. There's always an answer there. We just have to figure out, what it is. But you don't figure that out by giving somebody one flavor, right? I always say, if you just give me plain vanilla and I don't like it, you don't know what I like, right? But if you give me chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, I could tell you which flavor I like and why, right? It's a simple, silly illustration, but it really articulates like what we're trying to find out, with the client in this process. So I could go on and on different case studies, but I think this helps give some color to what that process looks like. And in terms of planning, we would love to plan 5 years out. If it's a year or 2 years, we have ways to collapse time and to get to the intended destination. And I will say that the transaction itself is not the destination, because at times what happens is we can have a client that we sell the majority of the company, but they maintain a minority piece of equity, with the larger strategic buyer. In another case study, in a transaction we just closed in June, that was our client's situation where he was looking to retire. His wife has since retired, so she put the pressure on him, like, hey, I'm sitting home alone. We're supposed to be traveling the world together, and you're working. So he had that pressure at home, which was good pressure. It was motivation more than anything.
Yeah.
And but we showed him a pathway where he can scale his time down over the next 2 years. In the initial transaction, he took 2/3 liquidity, and he maintained 1/3 equity. That equity roll forward was with a public company. Now, this is all public information now, because it's already happened. But when we announced the deal on a Tuesday in June, by Friday, the public stock was up 13.8% in a matter of days. And he did nothing to grow his business other than transact. And so the 1/3 equity that he maintained, grew by almost, was it 13, almost 14% in the same week he sold it. And so a lot of times these are unknowns to entrepreneurs. These are pathways to their destination that they didn't know they had options, or specifically these options. So that's what we're very good at. And that's what we love doing. And as I described earlier, these are the puzzles that I love to solve, because they are, right? You're given certain pieces and you got to figure out how to put it together.
I think it's fascinating. business to be in, and you get to see, and you're working with so many different types of businesses. I mentioned healthcare and tech and architecture, all these kinds of businesses. So you meet a whole bunch of different entrepreneurs. So when you come in and do this analysis, right? Do you send a team in? Do you go in and it's, I assume it's like, let me see your books, let me see your processes, your standard operating procedures. But when you do this, do you, first of all, who's the team that goes in and does it? Second of all, what are you finding that these businesses and business owners haven't done to get ready to exit? What are some of the common things that you're seeing? So
initially, we call them discovery days, and I love to participate in those discovery days and lead those meetings. There's varieties of what we can do, but it really depends on the client, because we always say we will move at the speed of the client. And so the discovery days are fun in my mind, because they're typically 4 hours. Typically, we don't want to take up everyone's entire day.
This is intense too.
It's intense.
A lot of questions. Yeah.
Thought-provoking questions, hard questions to answer, because these are questions that either they have never thought of, right? Or they've never been asked, or from somebody, or even asked themselves. So it really helps define where they're at in terms of this thinking, but the tangible outcome of this discovery day is this transferability assessment that I was describing. And then, so there's two components to it. And one of the components is the financial analysis. Now, we could either do that before the discovery day or after. It really depends on the client. But I will tell you, there are clients, when we do discovery days, it's revealed to all of us that their financial reporting is weak or subpar, right? We did a deal a couple of years ago where their financial record keeping was done on Excel. And that Excel workbook was messy. So we had to rebuild and reconstruct the financial statements. And this was not a small company. This was over $10 million a year revenue company, still operating on Excel. And it's just the way they operated. There's no right or wrong way to do it when you're operating, so as long as you have those measurements to direct your own business. But when it comes to an outside party looking inward, you have to have some sort of common reporting that is going to be identifiable to the marketplace. And that's what we did in that situation.
What are the tools that you use usually besides Excel to do that financial analysis then?
So it's unique to the business and to the industry, because what we find is, our AEC clients will use a certain set of project management tools that have an accounting component, which then provide, financial reporting. A manufacturing company is going to use a different software that's managing, the production of, I'll say, an aerospace company, let's say, that has both commercial and defense projects. And there's specific softwares for that industry, which also has an accounting component to it. But when you look at these systems, although they're fantastic when it comes to operating the day-to-day and the production and the work in progress and everything that goes into that, the outputs aren't exactly what the market wants to see from the standpoint of evaluating valuation, from the standpoint of evaluating cash flow, capital expenditures. And so we'll do that analysis, but sometimes we find that clients are just so far behind in their reporting, because you have to understand, when we come in, we're going to make measurements on their business that they've never thought of. And so in situations like that, and why having a year or 2 years to plan is important, is because we might advise them to bring on a professional CPA, or we might have them bring on an interim CFO that's going to come and develop KPIs for them to track and follow. We might hire a third-party quality of earnings firm to come in and qualify those earnings, right? Because when we go to market, no different than a public stockbroker trading, stocks of a public company, we are trading the ownership of a privately held business. The major difference is we're working off of snapshots of information at a particular date and time, where public companies are typically real time, typically, in terms of information and the data that's flowing through the marketplace. So when you are taking a snapshot, financial snapshot of a business that you're discussing 3 months later with an investor, the information's already outdated. And if the business doesn't have the tools to produce ongoing reporting, it's going to be difficult to get that type of transaction completed. So, long way of saying, we come in, we do the assessment in the discovery day. I do have a team that does the onboarding for the financial analysis. I have my lead financial analyst is Scott. He's been with me for 6 years, almost 7 years now. And so he knows exactly what measurements we want and I want to go in and make on the business. And ultimately what we're doing with those measurements is preparing the business to go to market and helping the buyer or the investor understand the risks in the business, but also understand the benefits of the business. And a risk, as an example, would be, I'll go back to aerospace manufacturing. There's only so many OEMs out there. And so there's naturally going to be customer concentration, revenue concentration. But so as long as that revenue concentration is under 25 to 30% of the total revenues, that's comfortable. But if we have a client that has a customer that's 80% of their revenues, we better have a very good narrative and understanding of why. Is that more transactional, or is it more of a partnership? If it is a partnership, is it unilateral or is it bilateral? Are you feeding each other business? And if we can understand that, then we can share that in our narrative, because we call it N squared, numbers and narrative. Because numbers are great, right? And they give us the measurements that we need. But narratives are just as important because it threads together with the story of that business and why the business is performing as well as it is, or perhaps they're going through a seasonality decline, right? Or seasonal decline, I should say. So we have to figure that out. And we do that through the discovery, through the financial analysis, and then we move forward. You had another question for me, and it slipped my mind.
No, yeah, I asked you like 3 questions at once. But so you do the workshop, you do the financial discovery. You're seeing that a lot of your clients, the financial reporting maybe isn't that great.
Correct.
And then then you go back, you get together with your team and you put together a plan and with milestones, I assume, and this is what we're suggesting. And then you have a meeting. I guess you go back to them and present basically your findings. Is that kind of the next steps?
Precisely it. Yes. And so what we do is we take those meetings in 90-day leaps, right? They could be more frequent, they could be less frequent, just depending on where the client is and how much that time they need to make those initial, shifts and adjustments that we're advising them on. But every 90 days, we have what we call as a transaction trigger. And we have a conversation and we say, okay, are we where we want to be? And are we ready to start entering into dialogues with the marketplace about the opportunity? If the answer is yes, then we move forward. If the answer is no, it's typically because there are tasks that still need to be completed, right? Or elements of the business that still need to be cured from a transferability standpoint. And the fun thing about this is that every 90 days we will reassess the valuation, based upon how they're scoring, and specifically on that valuation, spectrum valuation, or valuation of spectrum, right? Where do they land? In every 90 days, they're always improving. So if it was a 4 to 6 valuation range, you see it climbing and climbing and climbing. And it's very rewarding. And we put together what we call the Meritage stock ticker, the MST. And it shows them, if the frequency is every 90 days, the moves that they're making, how it's improving the value of their company. So it's a real-time feedback, real-time in the sense of every 90 days, but it shows them the reward of the hard work that they're doing. And that's how and we continue that for as long as that's needed, right? And there again, there are some of those transferability tasks or topics that just won't be cured until we consummate a transaction, right? For example, if it's a company that's servicing a specific geography, I mean, in some cases, it would take years to develop, that same business model in a different part of the country or the world. That might be one of those tasks, right, or goals that would be better addressed by the transaction itself. Because you have to remember, the client is typically looking for a pathway out, which means less risk and less reinvestment, not more time, more risk, and more investment.
That makes sense. Okay, so you have an overall plan, but then you're meeting every 90 days to say, okay, this was our suggestions for the next 90 days. Where are we?
Yeah.
Can we keep, do we need to keep moving forward in different ways? So back to a question I asked earlier, financial reporting, you're seeing that as something that maybe entrepreneurs and business owners, maybe there's some improvements that need to be made with their financial reporting. What other things are you seeing that companies typically are not, I guess, they're not strong in, areas they're not strong in that helps their valuations?
And to be fair to operators and entrepreneurs, the reality is their financial reporting could be great for their internal purposes, right? And so from that standpoint, we can't be too critical. But from the
to keep lights on, to keep the business going, right? Correct. The day to day. So they're in good. They're in they're in the black, right?
Yes.
They're not in the red.
Yes.
But it's not about the future valuation or selling the company.
Correct, because when it comes to evaluating the company or transferability of the business, we're going to make different measurements that they just might not be making, and because they may not be aware of it, or they may not have the source data to make those measurements. So in those cases, we do need to retool the way they're reporting. So in instances where, you heard the phrase, bad data in, bad data out, right? There's typically good data there, but if we cannot get to the intended measurement by way of triangulation at times, we are going to have to start making measurements in the business and suggestions to the operator and to the owner of that business on what they could be having their team manage, right, or monitor. A classic one in the AEC space is going to be work in progress. So a business cycle is you have a pipeline of opportunities which you work hard to transition to contracts. Those contracts become your backlog, right? And your backlog is then beginning at different times for different projects, but that turns to work in progress. And that work in progress is really where the measurements are lacking, right? Where are you in this project? Is it progress billing? Is it milestone billing? Is it, what is it? And they always have the answer, but they're not measuring where they are in that process. So that's a common measurement that we typically go back and say, okay, well, we need to track this on a weekly basis, ideally. Some companies are able to do it on a daily basis, depending on timesheets and the way they invoice. But that gives us good perspective of, then cash flow and AR and all sorts of other measurements that you typically see on the balance sheet. But until they make it to the balance sheet, pipeline of balance sheet, there's a lot of information in there that's just not recorded or monitored. And that's what we're typically focusing on in, let's say, the AEC space.
So other types of things that you're seeing that companies could improve to get ready for an exit?
So key personnel, right? So when you think of a business, if you're a service business, your assets are your people. And it was once illustrated to me that in a service company, just imagine a high-rise building. Everyone comes up that elevator every day. They sit at their desk, right? And they work. And they have certain skills and abilities and licenses and education that enables them to do the work that they do. And then at the end of that day, they go down the elevator and they go home, right? And you hope that they come back the next day because those are your assets. And, if you think about more of a manufacturing company, you don't have to worry about your manufacturing press not showing up to work the next day. Yeah, it might be broken down, right? Or due for maintenance, but it's always going to be there, right? Where in service companies, your people are your assets. They leave, they come back. And more in the modern world, you just hope they log in from home the next day, which is actually a whole nother subject because, that there's a big cultural shift there. I mean, if you're working from the same spot in your home every day, why does it matter to that individual? What flag of what company are they waving, right? That's a whole nother topic and subject. But at least for this topic of key employees that I'm touching on, you need to make sure that, they are committed to the organization as it grows and scales and potentially merges or even sells to a larger strategic. But it really comes down to when you think about the work that we do in that situation is understanding the expectations and managing those expectations. Sometimes they're realistic. Mostly they're realistic. Sometimes they're not. But we have to help, those individuals understand, what is realistic, what's achievable, and what does it mean for them. And I'm talking about key employees, non-shareholders, right? Because shareholders are going to behave in differently than a non-shareholder because they're going to have monetary benefit at the time the transaction closes. So as an example, there are ways that we can, and a lot of entrepreneurs are open to this, but there's ways that those key employees can be incentivized either by way of bonuses, minority equity, or some sort of upside potential post-transaction. And so as long as they're showing up and continuing to do what they're doing, right, then everybody wins, including that key employee. And what I love is when we do a transaction with, let's say, a single geography company merging or selling to a larger, national firm or group or international group. Let's say that business is in California and they grew up in Colorado, right? They merge with this larger entity, and now that California employee is saying, I would love to be back closer to home in Colorado. We have kids now. We can be closer to the in-laws. We can be closer to, the parents, the grandparents, and they have an opportunity to transfer, horizontally, right, without having to restart again at a new organization, and they can relocate, and that's something typically a smaller regional company can't offer to an employee. So there are benefits. And you just have to understand, what drives that individual. So we do some of this work, but we also have advisors that specialize on company culture and transferability of company culture so that culture maintains itself during an integration process. So, which is a whole nother set of services we don't offer, but we certainly have professionals that are experts in this space. And we will tap their shoulder and bring them in if and where needed. Okay.
How many companies then have you, or business owners, let's say entrepreneurs and business owners, have you helped exit over the years?
It's been
just a rough estimate.
Yeah. Hundreds. It's over hundreds of companies. I mean, you think about $2 billion of capital deployed. It's been over hundreds that our firm has managed. And I would say even collectively of those that have worked with the firm, and, one of my mentors, Craig Trass, was with me early on in 2005. He's since retired and he's racing Porsches now and loving life. And, collectively over thousands of companies.
Okay. Right? So you've met with
Oh gosh.
Just hundreds of entrepreneurs and business owners.
Yeah, so many field trips.
And from that experience of sitting across the table and having dinners and lunches and workshopping with these entrepreneurs, what is one of the top skills or attributes, the successful ones that you really went, wow, this entrepreneur is very successful, whether it's based on exit numbers, based on who they are as an individual? What are some of those top attributes of entrepreneurs?
So what's interesting is the common theme there is that what made that entrepreneur successful in the early stages of the development of their business, typically they become distracted with nuances of running the day-to-day, whether it be insurance renewals, HR related issues, all of those tasks and responsibilities in and around a growing company. But the very thing that allowed them to launch that company and be successful with that business, you find that those that struggle have become distracted with those other elements of the business, and they lose focus of what made them successful to begin with. I can tell you personally, 5 years into our firm, I had the most people. I think I had 20 people in the firm. We're a boutique firm, so we're about, a half a dozen today. But I made the least amount of money with the most amount of people, right? Because of those distractions. I personally, at that time in that age, I struggled with that, right? But what made me successful early in my career, and I'll pick on myself here, is that I was very good at solving those puzzle pieces. I was very good at aligning the right capital for the opportunity to get it to the intended target. And entrepreneurs and clients are not all that different, but the common denominator of those that were successful were very good at keeping themselves disciplined on what made them successful and doing that rinse and repeat day in, day out, over and over and over again, and creating a system that they weren't working, but the system that they developed was working for them and enabling them to do more of what they're already good at, right? And that's the common theme and common denominator. One observation I've made too is that when you look at an entrepreneur, and I've worked for people early in my career, and I'm sure you have, but I could think of those that I worked with or for that just were inconsistent in their behavior. Meaning, let's pick a Billy. Let's make up a name, Billy. You work for Billy. The Billy you get today is different than the Billy tomorrow. And the Billy you get next week is another version that may not be enjoyable, right? And personally, in my personal life, in my business life, one thing that I have been very mindful of is being disciplined, but more importantly, being consistent. If you show up, you just said earlier in this interview, we had a couple calls. You could expect the same Brian Franco today as you had on those calls. That consistency is, as a human being, we look for that. We gravitate towards that. Because when you're leading an organization, and specifically people, they want to know, they want that consistency in your leadership. They want that consistency in your guidance, and for specifically us as advisors. And if we ever, show up differently, it's confusing and it's distracting. And I will tell you, those that have, the common denominators of those that have been successful have been both disciplined and consistent. And I could distill it down to those two things. Now, there's obviously other reasons, right, what make an individual successful, but those are just two key elements that I've observed in my life.
What's a book that you recommend the most to people, Brian?
Oh, gosh. I think the books that have really resonated for me is, if it's one book on this topic that I'm talking about, and I should remember the author of 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. Right?
Okay.
Great book. It speaks to what I was just talking about, how, we as entrepreneurs can become distracted, right? So you want to focus. There's an exercise in that book that has you focus on those tasks that make you the most money or generate the most revenue for your company. And those tasks that, have to be done, but don't generate revenue or generate very little revenue could be, offloaded into a system, right? Which ultimately enables, the leaders of an organization and empowers them to move forward and grow. I also love, if you'd allow me, another book is 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership by John C. Maxwell. John C. Maxwell in that book talks about, if you want to develop a true leader, right, put them in a nonprofit setting, right, and see how they lead those people. Because in a nonprofit setting, as you may have experienced, you're dealing with volunteers. Those individuals are showing up because they want to participate in whatever that nonprofit organization focus is, but they don't have to listen to you as a leader. They don't have a paycheck that they're waiting for at the end of the week, right? So, you don't have that power over them. And because you don't have that power over them, I think John C. Maxwell says in that book, a good leader by how many followers they have, right? And in a nonprofit setting, if the driver's not income, right, for people to show up, and you could still lead them and they still follow you. He just, and that was one of the rules that he came up with, but I see it to be true as well, right? And I tested that even in my own life, and I've experienced that in my own life. And so I think those are two really good books.
Awesome. So we've gone over time. I appreciate the time that you've spent here. I just have a lightning round of questions to get to know you a little bit better, and we'll wrap up. So,
okay, fantastic.
So what is your favorite candy bar? Snickers. Favorite music artist?
It varies, but I'm a big Pearl Jam fan.
Favorite cereal?
Rice Krispies.
Mac or PC?
Mac.
Google or Microsoft?
Google.
Dogs or cats?
Dogs. I'm allergic to cats. And cats are just not loyal.
Phantom or Les Mis?
Ooh. I've seen both. I'm going to have to go with Les Mis.
All right. What's something that most people don't know about you?
I shared in this recording about being, a young father, right? And so a lot of, strangers don't know this about me, right? Because I have younger kids, and, you always have people come up to you and say, hey, be careful. They're going to grow up so fast. And, then it's like, do I explain the story? But that's something that most folks don't know about me.
Yeah. I loved learning about that because I think it's part of who you are.
Absolutely.
Taking on that responsibility at such a young age. Yeah. And you have a wonderful son, and he actually is working with you.
Yes.
And producing your podcast. We didn't get a chance to talk about it yet, but how do people find your podcast, and tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we my oldest son, Jacob, he graduated from AFI, American Film Institute, last year. And he's now an adjunct professor as well, teaching film and directing. And what a better teammate to have, right? And happens to be my oldest son. It's a fun dynamic, but we produced and written a show called Private Capital Mastery. You could find it on wherever you consume podcasts. But Private Capital Mastery continues to talk about the journey of the entrepreneur and how to leverage the private capital markets to achieve that growth and scale, and to ultimately generate what I'll call, create generational wealth through massive exit strategies. And we talk about, it's an insider's playbook on how to do that. And we unpack little by little by little every week, because there's a lot to unpack. And we've developed and built a community around this, and it's been fun. It's been inspiring, and you meet a lot of really good people, and including yourself. Without that podcast, I don't think we would have ever met, and I'm very grateful to not only be here with you, but to know you and now to have that lasting relationship with you.
Likewise, it's been such a pleasure getting to know you, Brian. We'll put links to Meritage Partners.
Yes.
We'll put links to your podcast. However,
Yes.
your LinkedIn as well.
Yeah.
I know you're posting clips from the podcast on LinkedIn,
Yes.
so I'd encourage all the listeners to go follow Brian on LinkedIn as well. But thank you so much for driving down today to Carlsbad. It's been so fun I feel like we could talk for hours. There's so many things to unpack.
We could.
And there's so many lessons you've learned, and the people you're working with are people that I'd like to reach, with this podcast too. And so thank you so much for being here, Brian. I wish you and Meritage Partners massive success in the coming years. And I hope one day you can retire so you can join all the people you've helped exit on those fishing trips.
Yes.
And again, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And yes, we could probably go on for another hour and a half, but happy to come back at any time and talk more about anything that you think is relevant to your listener base. But again, we'll put those links in, but Meritage-partners.com is our website. Private Capital Mastery is our podcast. And of course, you have my number personally, so I look forward to staying in touch and getting together. Carlsbad, wherever it may be, I'll come find you.
I'll take it. I love the sunny weather here.
Yes, there's a lot to love. Thank you so much, Kyle.